Okay, so in this next lesson, we'll look at the supply of labor after having finished the demand for labor. So we begin this discussion on supply with the importance of trade-offs. So the market for labor faces a trade-off between labor and leisure. So we can look at this from the standpoint of a production possibilities curve. If you want to increase leisure by an hour, you must give up an hour of labor. So if we decrease labor by 1 hour from, let's say, A to B, it's going to cause an increase in leisure from A to B. So that's the trade-off. So the opportunity cost of an hour of leisure is the wages of an hour's work. So if you're making $20 an hour, well, in order for you to have 1 hour of leisure, it's going to cost you $20. Now, as a result, when wages are increased, it becomes too expensive to take off for leisure time, and workers give up the leisure time to earn money. So when your wage is getting up there, it becomes too high of an opportunity cost. So you won't take off because you're going to lose too much money doing so. And as a result, people give up the leisure time to earn more money. Now we can kind of see that here when we look at the supply curve. So this is the supply curve for wages. You'll notice, of course, as the wage increases, the number of laborers willing to work increases. So this results in an upward sloping curve. We can see it going up because as wages increase, more and more people are entering the market. They're more willing and able to work a job. So as wages rise, households are more willing and able to supply labor. So the supply of labor increases as wages rise. There is, however, a small catch to this. So when you look at the labor going up, when the wage rates go up and you look at the quantity of labor increasing, one of the things that's interesting is that wages can increase to the point that laborers earn enough to take more leisure time, causing the supply curve to actually slope backwards. So what we see in the market is that if wages are really, really high, people can afford to take more time off because they're making so much money. Okay, let's look at this example of a backward sloping supply curve. So as wage rates increase, workers are willing to work more weeks and give up more weeks of leisure time up to a certain point. So as we graph this out, you'll notice that the supply curve actually bends backwards. And the reason for this is very simple. Once this worker is making over $2,000 a week, they can afford to take more time off. And so that's what we're seeing. So when we see the original equilibrium at 1375, and 35 weeks. That's where our worker originally started. Then we see an increase in wages to $2,000. So the wage rises from current rate to the maximum rate, which is $2,000 a week. That leads this worker to increase the work time from 35 to 42 weeks. So we see a number of weeks worked rises. So on our graph, when the worker gets paid $2,000, they're willing to work for 42 weeks a year. Now, when that wage rate increases to $28.50 though, the worker can afford to only work 35 weeks per year. So what happens, of course, is we see this go back down. So when wage rate rises again, the worker can afford to trade weeks worked for weeks of leisure. So they can take off more time, and thus we end up with this backward sloping supply curve because there reaches a point at which you can just take off more time because you have the available wealth. So our next topic then is shifts on the supply curve. So shifts in labor supply curve occur when influences other than wage rates change. So when we take our labor demand, we have our labor supply curve here. So we'll notice this is our regional equilibrium. So we're looking here at a wage rate of 1375, and we've got down here equilibrium quantity of tire makers of 28. So that's our original equilibrium. Now, what happens when the labor supply shifts? So when this shifts out here to the right, we see an increase in labor from LS0 to LS1. So now we have an increase in the quantity of laborers. So the number of workers rises. So we'll see it rises to like 37. So if the supply of labor increased, we'll notice the equilibrium wage rate falls. So wages go down. So the wage rate would fall. So here's what's happening. When labor increases, the wage rate falls. And the reason, of course, is because now we have more workers in the market. So markets with larger numbers of people have lower wages. Markets with less amounts of people have higher wages. So the more people there are in a job market, the less valuable that job is, thus the less the wages. So if you're looking to make a lot of money, you need to enter into the labor market in fields in which have a smaller supply. This explains why we have minimum wages and why working conditions in some areas are so low. Simply because of the fact that there's so many people in there and it takes so little skill to do that the wages are just very, very low. Now, the primary influences that create shifts in supply are changes in the adult population, change in preferences, alternative opportunities, or time in school and training. So let's look at this in a little more detail. Let's look at the supply determinants. So these are the things that are going to cause our shifts. The first of which is a change in adult population. So as the population of a country increases, the supply of labor increases. And this could be due to birth rates exceeding death rates, which means that you have more babies being born than you have elderly people passing away. Immigration into a country or immigration out. Internal shifts of the population. This is one we see several times within the United States, particularly at the end of wars. At the end of the Civil War, at the end of World War I, we saw shifts in the internal population. During World War II, we saw significant shifts into coastal areas, into the Gulf Coast of the South, and also into on the West Coast, where you saw laborers moving into areas that needed employment increases because of wartime industries. So we see these shifts taking place. Another is a change in preferences. So when people's preferences or tastes change in labor, shifts in the labor supply can occur. So in other words, as people change their preferences or their taste in the types of jobs they actually want to do. So since 1948, the number of women in the workforce has increased, which is one of the things we looked at. The number of men has decreased. So the result's been an increase in the supply of labor overall. There's more women in this country than there are men. But at the same time, different types of jobs. So for example, since the development of the internet and with computers and laptops and all these other wonderful things, you've seen an increase into the number of people entering into those types of job markets and away from other types of job markets, so much so that some don't exist anymore. For example, there's no such thing as people sitting around pushing buttons and moving long distance calls around anymore. We don't have phone operators. Those people have simply disappeared. Manufacturing jobs in the United States have simply disappeared because we're using robotics to do those jobs. So we see a shift in preferences into the types of jobs people are going into. Our third determinant is alternative opportunities. Supply of labor is also influenced by alternative opportunities that arise. So, supply of labor in any one market depends on the supply of labor in another market. Here's what we mean by that. If the wage rate in one labor market rose, workers may shift. So to give you an example, you have software developers in the computer industry that may be leaving that market and switching into a job market that does app development on tablets, because as the number of tablets increase, the number of apps increase, that becomes a more valuable market to work in and wages rise. So people shift from one to another. And this is a common thing, and this is one of those deals where when you're looking at the type of degree you're going to get in college, you have to understand what's going on in that market, because you may enter into something that simply is going to be outdated. I'll give you a really good example. If you think about phones, there has been a significant decrease, of course, in the type of jobs within the phone industry, because you're not making landlines anymore, and you don't have operators who are moving phone calls around and switchboards and things. Those things don't exist anymore. So because they don't exist, there's entire markets that have just disappeared. You look at American manufacturing and you see that the large number of manufacturing jobs have just disappeared within this market because we have robotics to do it. So it makes more sense going into a field in which you see an increase in the demand for laborers than it does to go into one in which that field is simply just disappearing. And so if this were to happen, then the market they were in would see a decrease in the supply of labor, and that's what's taking place. The fourth is time in school and training. The amount of time people stay in school reduces the amount of unskilled labor in the market. So if a large number of students dropped out of high school, then markets with low skilled laborers would see an increase in the labor supply. Now, to put this into good perspective, if we saw an increase in the number of high school kids that were dropping out in the next couple of years, those students would be entering into job markets in which they paid minimum wage. Problem with that is, of course, is there's such a large number of individuals already in that market, it's going to be tough to get a job. When you do get a job in those markets, what you're looking at is there's not much opportunity for growth or wage increases or things of this nature because you just don't have any skills. So it makes more sense to stay in school because the more education and training you get, the more skill set you have, the more expertise you have, reduces the number of people you're competing against for jobs, and thus wages increase. So by staying in school for longer periods, students learn new skills, and when those students do leave school, they enter highly skilled labor markets, which see an increase in labor supply. And so there's a lot of shifts and stuff taking place.